Hello, this is the second lecture in a series on how we got our Bible. Much of its substance is drawn from an excellent book, A General Introduction to the Bible, From Ancient Tablets to Modern Translations, by David Ewart. I'm grateful to Zondervan Publishers for permission to draw upon it. In the first session, we took a cursory look at the Bible, its two testaments, the variety of books that it contains, and its overall theme. Now we turn to the languages used by its authors. Language is much more than just a vocabulary and a set of rules of grammar. It is a realm of images and ideas, and of the relationships between them. It is to a considerable extent a lens through which we perceive reality. Knowing even a bit about the languages of the Bible and how they were written enhances our ability to understand its message. That's our agenda for today. Let's see how well we understand our own language, English. Let's talk food. Are you hungry? How about a nice bratwurst or a frankfurter? Maybe just a roll with a wiener? Or would you prefer a hamburger? Perhaps a soft pretzel? Really hungry? Then let's have some knockwurst with sauerkraut. I'm speaking English, right? Or am I? You certainly notice that all those foods have German names. Are they German then? Or English? Or maybe both? Well, suppose you're a guy who'd like to meet somebody. Prefer a brunette and chic? You don't want somebody with a fiancé, right? But she ought to be petite and adorable. But you don't want to be accused of being a voyeur. Recognize all that? French, of course, but well understood by somebody who never left Cincinnati or Atlanta. Let's try food again. Some chili maybe, or a burrito? Perhaps an enchilada or just a barbecue sandwich. Too much? Then maybe a few nachos, topped off with a banana and a square of chocolate. We're doing Spanish now, aren't we? But if the terms hadn't been on a list like this, we would think we never left English. The point of all this is easy to see. English has appropriated words from many other languages, and essentially made them at home with us. And ours is not the only language that has done that. All of them have, more or less, and Hebrew is no exception. Hebrew belongs to the Semitic family of languages. The term Semitic may remind us of Shem, one of the sons of Noah, and there is probably a connection, but it doesn't necessarily identify an ethnic group. Semitic languages are really just a linguistic family. And once we can identify it definitely in history, Hebrew belongs to the Northwest Semitic group. Its origins, like those of most languages, are not precisely known. But suppose we started with the father of the Hebrews, Abram himself. He came from Ur in Chaldea, in the land of the two rivers, and there it appears that Aramaic was spoken. At God's calling, he and his family moved to Haran, and there the natives spoke Akkadian. After the death of his father Terah, Abram again followed God's call and migrated south into Canaan. There his neighbors all spoke Canaanite. He did briefly visit Egypt, but it was generations later that his descendants, some 70 of them, accompanied Jacob to the Nile Delta, and there they spent centuries among people who spoke Egyptian. Once God acted to bring them out of Egyptian slavery, they were genuinely speaking Hebrew, but in the course of the centuries since Abraham, their language had picked up bits of Aramaic, Akkadian, Canaanite, and Egyptian. Even a brief look at Hebrew shows us that it has some defining characteristics. For example, it does not do subordinate clauses, but prefers just to put main clauses together with conjunctions, especially and. Most of our English versions of Genesis 12:4 say that Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. But the Hebrew says, Abram was 75 years old and he set out from Haran. It's also a language that likes vivid expressions. We may say that a person has a divided loyalty. Hebrew will say the person has a heart and a heart. Clear enough, and certainly vivid. That desire for vividness shows itself also in extreme contrast. To show his preference for Jacob as the son of the promise, God will say, I loved Jacob, but Esau I hated. Malachi 1, 2, and 3. We might say, exaggeration, but Hebrew would say, just making the point. Then, too, when we recall that Jesus was steeped in the Hebrew tradition, it shouldn't surprise us that, even though the Gospels are in Greek, that influence shows itself. What did Jesus say? If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:26. That's how Hebrew shows contrast. And there are other distinctives to the language. Note this. Where we use a noun and adjective, Hebrew prefers a noun paired with another noun. Where English would say, a beautiful garden, Hebrew will say, a garden of beauty. Or, in English, a holy mountain, but in Hebrew, a mountain of holiness. Same idea, but a different preferred way of expressing it. And that penchant for vivid expression showed itself also in using physical terms or images to refer to emotion. An English speaker would say, I was afraid. But in Scripture, we'd more likely see, my bones melted. That's the language in which, for the most part, our Old Testament was written. But another language turns up there, Aramaic. The Bible doesn't give a lot of attention to different languages, of course, and the first example we see of Aramaic comes when Jacob, after having worked for his uncle Laban for years, slips away with his wives and servants. Laban overtakes him, and they reach an uneasy truce to be marked by a ritual. Genesis 31 tells us, quote, So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, Gather some stones. So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, This heap is a witness between you and me today. That is why it is called Galeed. It was also called Mizpah, because he said, May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. That's Genesis 31, 45 through 49. I recall that many years ago, our church liked to recite what they called the Mizpah benediction, never realizing, I guess, that when Jacob and Laban parted with those words, it was with suspicion and ill will. But we shouldn't miss the linguistic clue in this passage. Jacob calls the monument Galeed. That's Hebrew. But Laban calls it Jegar Sahadutha. That's Aramaic, the first example of the language we find in Scripture. but it won't be the last. In fact, Aramaic will grow to become dominant in the life of Israel. With the passage of centuries, new empires rise. The Assyrian and Persian empires, as it happens, had Aramaic as their official language from about the 10th through the 4th centuries BC. And given that the Jews lived under the shadow of these empires, that language influenced them. Remember the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib's army? We all know how that ended, with the intervention of God's angel, who killed 180,000 of the invaders and broke the siege. But think back before that event. We can read it in 2 Kings 18:17-37. Sennacherib's envoy calls out to the defenders on Jerusalem's walls, telling them they have no hope. Haven't the Assyrians defeated kingdom after kingdom? And did the gods of those kingdoms protect them from Assyria? Then why trust King Hezekiah when he says their God will protect them? The captains of the Jews call out and ask the Assyrian to speak in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, since they can understand that. But he replies that he's using Hebrew deliberately, so that all the common people on the walls can hear his threats. The Jews are just beginning to pick up another language. So it should not shock us to see that some Aramaic begins at this point to appear in the Bible itself. In Daniel 2:4b through 7:28, some 6 chapters are in Aramaic. Ezra 4:8 through 6:18 and 7:12 through 26 are also in Aramaic. It has begun to crowd out Hebrew. But how could that happen? The rabbis even referred to Hebrew as the sacred language. And yet, look at what happened to the Jews in this period. From Israel and Judah, both populations suffered exile. Assyria destroys the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and many of its people are deported to Aramaic-speaking Assyria. Then, 150 years later, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon imposes the same fate on Judah. During the 70 years of the so-called Babylonian captivity, 2 new generations of Jews will have grown up in Babylon and acquired the language. And when they returned to Judea, they brought the language back with them. Ezra had to deal with that situation when he was urging the people to repentance and revival. In Nehemiah chapter 8, we read about the great assembly he held for them. Accordingly, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could hear with understanding. So they read from the book, from the law of God, with interpretation. They gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Nehemiah 8, verses 2 and then 8. Why did they need assistance to provide interpretation? Ezra was reading the law in Hebrew, of course, but the crowd's understanding of that language had become sketchy. The assistants were doing simultaneous translation into Aramaic. Now move down again to the time of Jesus. Hebrew and Aramaic had lived side by side in people's minds and on their tongues now for centuries. What did they actually speak? Though there is some disagreement, it seems likely that the average Jew spoke Aramaic. We do know that, at least in some instances, Jesus did. When Jairus begged him to heal his dying daughter, do you recall what he said? He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Mark 5:41. Talitha cum. That's Aramaic. And when Mark tells of a man deaf and unable to speak clearly who is brought to Jesus, what does he do? He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means, be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Mark 7:34 and 35. Once again, Aramaic. He may not have spoken it on all occasions, but we know that sometimes he did. Interestingly enough, it seems that Aramaic had become so settled in Israel that there were some regional differences. We find a reference to that at the time of Jesus' arrest. Peter, afraid to be associated with him, but desperate for news, slips into the courtyard of the high priest's palace. You know what happens next. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you're a Galilean." Mark 14:69 and 70. Apparently, Peter's Aramaic had a Galilean twang to it. But the New Testament, as we all know, was written in Greek. That fact requires us to glance at its origins in the Indo-European family of languages. That is a huge family, including nearly all the languages of Europe and of India. The major groups are Germanic, Slavic, Italic, Albanian, Indo-Iranian, Celtic, Latin, and Greek. But those are only the major groups. Slavic, for example, includes Polish, Czech, Bulgarian, Slovene, Serbian, and Russian. And Latin, though now a dead language, that is, not spoken natively by anyone, still gave rise to Portuguese, Spanish, French, Sardinian, Italian, and Romanian. And there are many more besides. As for Greek, its origins lie somewhere in Central Europe. In the period from around 2000 to 1000 BC, there were successive waves of migration from there down into the Balkan Peninsula. They spoke slightly different dialects of Greek: Ionic, Aeolic, Doric, and Attic. But with the passage of time, eventually Attic Greek came to dominate. The so-called Golden Age of Greece, which saw the flowering of art, architecture, poetry, history, philosophy, and medicine, plus the invention of democracy, expressed itself in Attic Greek. We still call that Classical Greek. Then, in the 330s BC, came Alexander the Great, with a lust to conquer the world. As we all know, he nearly succeeded. What he did succeed in doing was to carry Greek culture and the Greek language throughout the lands he invaded. And even after his passing, the culture and the language took root and grew. But it was a slightly different kind of Greek. We call it Koine, the common Greek. What kind of Greek was that, anyway? Well, it was not the Greek of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, nor the Greek of the dialogues of Plato, or the treatises of Aristotle. They wrote from the 8th through the 4th centuries BC. It was not even like the Greek of Plutarch or Josephus, though they wrote when Koine was commonly spoken in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. For some reasons, scholars were puzzled at this. Was the New Testament written in some sort of Holy Spirit language? Bishop Lightfoot, around 1880, had a suspicion that later proved sound. He mused, "If we could only recover letters that ordinary people wrote to each other, we should have the greatest possible help for the understanding of the language of the New Testament generally." And then we did. At an obscure site in Upper Egypt called Oxyrhynchos, two young archaeologists began poking around in a trash dump. The year was 1896, and the men were named Grenfell and Hunt. What they found in that trash was an immense number of papyri from the Roman period. Some were of important literary works, but most were just what Bishop Lightfoot had dreamed about. Quote, "Most consisted of public and private documents, codes, edicts, registers, official correspondence, census returns, tax assessments, petitions, court records, sales, leases, wills, bills, accounts, inventories, horoscopes, and private letters." And we suddenly had access to the kind of Greek that real people used in New Testament times. It greatly enhanced our understanding of the New Testament. Just one example. In the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, he told them to pray, "Give us today our epiousios bread." Commentators had struggled with what that meant, because in all of the literature of classical Greek, that word never appeared. So what might it mean? Was Jesus saying we should ask for the bread of life? Or was this somehow related to the Lord's Supper? And then, among the Oxyrhynchos papyri, the word turned up. On a woman's shopping list, epiousios meant daily. And so, Koine Greek is not the Greek of the poets or philosophers. It's the kind of Greek real people spoke or wrote. The peoples whom Alexander had conquered learned Greek, but not all the literary subtleties and artful constructions of the classical age. What they learned was leaner, smoother, and more direct. One scholar memorably observed, "Koine Greek is, essentially, classical Greek, with the bugs worked out." Looking back at it now, none of this should surprise us. After all, the Bible is a revelation from God to men. He would not have given it in the language of heaven, or we wouldn't have been able to understand it at all. It would not even be a revelation. He spoke to us in the language we knew. In the beginning, he spoke to the chosen people, and he did so in the Hebrew that they knew. When, many centuries later, they had begun to speak Aramaic, portions of Daniel and Ezra appeared in that tongue. And when the time for the fullest revelation came, when the whole Mediterranean world knew Greek, at least as their second language, that revelation was written in the language they all could understand. Now it's time to consider the actual process of writing. Although there are many hundreds of languages around the globe, it's fair to say that there are only 3 kinds of writing, or maybe 4, depending on how you understand the first kind. Let's start with that. It's usually called logographic, and there are 2 versions of it. The simpler kind is what most people would call picture writing. If we see a picture like this, say on the wall of a cave, we'd all recognize it as a woolly mammoth. The picture stands for the object itself. Here's another example, and we immediately identify a leaf, an insect of some kind, and a hand. But there is a second, more subtle use of these pictograms. They may represent something that the picture implies. For example, the mammoth might mean strength. A hand might mean help, or an insect, crop infestation. Now the picture has become an ideogram. It stands not for a physical object, but for an idea. Notice that these logograms are independent of language. That is, it doesn't matter what language is spoken by the artist or by the person who sees the symbols. A person who doesn't even know the language the artist spoke may still understand the symbol. But there is a potential relationship to language in these symbols, and we all recognize it, especially if we enjoy puzzles. If we see these three symbols, an eye, a heart shape, and a female sheep, we may well understand it to mean, I love you. But that interpretation only works for a speaker of English, because our word for an I sounds like the pronoun I, and the word you sounds like the pronoun you. A German speaker would pronounce this as something like Auge, Herz, Schaf. In other words, nonsense. Well, it is commonly believed that writing developed from logograms to ideograms and on. And whether that is correct or not, this is one of the types of writing. The second is the syllabary. That's a term we don't often hear, but it refers to a system where each symbol represents a syllable, that is, a vowel and a consonant. Perhaps the most known syllabary is this one, used on the island of Crete in the late 2nd millennium BC. Scholars had been unable to decipher it or even determine what language it represented. They just called it Linear B. Then Michael Ventris came along. He had been a code breaker in World War II, and he put his skills to work on this system of writing. Eventually he found, to most people's surprise, that the unknown language was actually an early form of Greek, in which each symbol represented a syllable. As you can see here, da, ja, ka, ma. Each symbol a consonant followed by an A sound, and another set of symbols for those consonants followed by the E sound. It turns out, by the way, that Egyptian hieroglyphics, which look so much like picture writing, are also a syllabary. So, from each symbol meaning an object, or an idea, or a word, to each one meaning just a syllable, we're moving down, aren't we? And so, the next stage brings us symbols that each represent a letter of the alphabet, or an alphabetic script. But that stage comes in two steps, beginning with a proto-alphabet. That's when each symbol represents a consonant and vowels do not appear at all. Ancient Phoenician was like that, and so was ancient Hebrew. Here's an example that may be familiar. Recall that Hebrew is read from right to left, and we see three letters here. They represent the SH sound, the L, and the M. A speaker of Hebrew knows at once that they form the word shalom, the traditional greeting that means peace. Where do the vowels come in? They come from the reader's own knowledge of the language, English speakers can do the same, up to a point. If we see on, say, a bumper sticker, PRMSD, most of us will immediately read promised. And if asked how we knew that, we'd probably say, well, nothing else makes sense. There are some ambiguities here and there, but the all-consonant system is workable. But of course, we would prefer a true alphabet. And for this, we have to thank the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Out of their commercial dealings came the world's first true alphabet. It happened like this. Phoenician had, like Hebrew, a proto-alphabet that consisted only of consonantal sounds. Somewhere around the 8th century BC, the Greeks saw and borrowed their system of writing, but with one key difference. You see, the Phoenician language had some guttural consonant sounds that don't exist in Greek. So when the Greeks borrowed those symbols, they had no use for sounds they couldn't even pronounce. So they used those symbols to represent vowel sounds, and the first true alphabet was born. And in fact, unlikely as it seems, this is the one and only time that an alphabet was invented. All of the world's other alphabets are derived in one way or another from this one. Here's the Greek alphabet alongside our English, or rather Latin alphabet, with the vowels highlighted. Aleph had been a guttural in Phoenician. It became the vowel alpha in Greek, or A in our sequence, and so on. Now we can take a little closer look at Hebrew. Here is its alphabet, or rather proto-alphabet, since it consists of 22 letters, all of them consonants. And here are the consonant sounds that they represent. You can see that two of them, Aleph and Ayin, have no equivalent for us. They represent guttural sounds that don't exist in our language. This is, by the way, the modern standard form of the letters, but as you might guess, their shapes have changed over the centuries. Here are a few examples. One of the earliest inscriptions we have is the so-called Gezer calendar. It comes from around 1000 BC, about the time of King Saul, and is a simple agricultural calendar, marking times of planting, cultivation, and harvest. If we move down a few centuries, we'll find the Moabite stone, sometimes called the Mesha inscription. It was actually authorized by King Mesha of Moab, whose language was almost identical at this period to Hebrew. It told of how his army had defeated the forces of a son of King Omri of Israel. It was a genuine victory, but like most such inscriptions, it exaggerates a bit. It tells how Israel had been eliminated forever. Then, later still, is this inscription from about 700 BC. It was found in the tunnel that King Hezekiah had made to bring the waters of the Gihon spring from just outside the east wall of Jerusalem into the city to feed the pool of Siloam. The inscription gives us an account of how the tunnel was cut, with workers digging from opposite ends until they finally met, creating a tunnel 6 football fields long. It was an amazing engineering feat, and this inscription records it. The next example comes from the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to around the 1st century BC. By this time, Hebrew script had developed into the form that it would continue to have down to our own day. It's often called the square script, since most of the letters are in a somewhat boxy shape. For 1,000 years, then, Hebrew remained technically a proto-alphabet. It had no means of designating vowel sounds, which the reader had to supply. But then came a change, the introduction of vowel points. After the disasters the Jews had experienced in their 2 rebellions against Rome, the one we all know of from 66 to 70 A.D., when the temple was destroyed according to Jesus' prophecy, and then the so-called Bar Kokhba rebellion 50 years later, they found themselves scattered across the Mediterranean world and in danger of losing their ethnic identity. And worse, if the people adopted the languages of the people among whom they were now living, they might forget Hebrew and actually be unable to read the sacred text that God had given them. A script without vowels is legible only to people who know its language. But what were the rabbis to do? They could not change the sacred text. That had been explicitly forbidden by God. And so they arrived at an ingenious compromise. The text would remain untouched, but below the letters they could place a series of dots and marks to represent the vowels. For example, if we read these letters from right to left, as is proper in Hebrew, notice the vowel sounds that are represented by the marks under each one. De, G, Mi, He, Va. And so, by the 2nd century or so, with the invention of vowel pointing, Hebrew at last acquired a true alphabet. We come then to the other major Bible language, Greek. Someone beginning a study of Greek today may be somewhat intimidated, saying that they'll have to learn a whole new alphabet. But it's not nearly so bad as that. The letters may look different, but the alphabet is really basically the same. These are, by the way, the lowercase version of the letters. And here are the equivalent letters in our alphabet. When we look at the two side by side, we can see that the order is very similar, and most of the Greek letters have a corresponding English letter and sound. Just a few don't have an exact corresponding letter, like theta, which is a th sound, and psi, which is really a ps. There had been 24 Phoenician letters that the Greeks borrowed, so their alphabet has 24. The letters that stood for gutturals in Phoenician, for which there were no equivalent sounds in Greek, left the Greeks with some extra letters. The happy insight they had was to use them for vowels. So what had been an aleph became alpha, our broad A. Epsilon and eta became the short and long E sounds. Iota became an I. Omicron and omega, the short and long O sounds. And ypsilon, either the U or Y sound. Our Latin alphabet follows the pattern as well. So then, these were the languages God chose as the vehicles for his revelation. But the authors needed something on which to record that revelation, and a number of materials were used in the times of the Bible. There was stone, desirable for something that was to be a permanent record. The 10 Commandments, you recall, were engraved on 2 tablets of stone. Rulers in antiquity often resorted to stone for laws or decrees or very special records, like this, the Rosetta Stone. Found in Egypt in 1799 by Napoleon's men, it was the same text in 3 languages: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. The latter 2 were known, but hieroglyphic still defied decipherment for a quarter century, until the French scholar Champollion was finally able to translate it, opening up hieroglyphics for scholars everywhere. But another permanent material was clay. When fired, it became quite durable. Civilizations like the Sumerian and Old Babylonian used it, employing the cuneiform script that you see here, combined wedge-shaped marks. This is one tablet of the famous Gilgamesh epic, which includes the Babylonian legend of the Great Flood. Distorted in its events and filled with references to pagan gods, it still provides witness of a memory that these people had of Noah and of God's judgment. Some scholars believe that the 10 divisions of the book of Genesis may have been on clay tablets like this one, handed down from generation to generation to be used ultimately by Moses. But stone and clay, though durable, are awkward to handle and not suited to long documents. Papyrus, made from the stalks of that plant that grows along the Nile, suited that purpose very well, whether in scroll form or cut into pages and glued together for what we call book form. It becomes brittle and fragile with age, so it is only in special conditions, like the desert regions of Egypt or in a sealed jar, that it can survive the centuries. Parchment serves the same need as papyrus for recording long documents, either in scroll or codex form, and it is far more durable. Essentially, the skins of animals, like calves or sheep, scraped and bleached. It can resemble fine paper, but it is expensive, and especially so for the loss of the animals. It took, for example, the skins of about 300 sheep to provide material for one Bible. The people of Bible times also needed one-time use materials, scratch paper, in effect. And for that purpose, they utilized ostraca, the broken shards of pottery that could be found everywhere. A famous example of this you can see here. These are ostraca, large enough to scratch a few words on their glazed surface. In Athens of the classical period, the democracy had a remarkable system for protecting the state from people who grew too powerful. From time to time, they would declare an ostracism, and each citizen would scratch on one of these ostraca the name of the person they thought might be dangerous to the democracy. The winner would be required to go into exile for a few years, long enough for his political power base to dissipate. It was exile without malice, almost an honor, you might say. But then from the Far East came a writing material that eclipsed all the others. The Chinese were the inventors of paper, and after it reached the Mediterranean world, its value gradually made it the material of choice, though it took many years. Here is a Gutenberg Bible. Even here, in the dawning age of printing, paper was still just edging out parchment for use in important documents. Some of the copies of Gutenberg's Bible were done in parchment, but more in paper. So, here are the languages and the writing materials that were used by God both to reveal His Word and to see it preserved for the ages. In the next lecture, we will see how the books of the Old Testament were produced, collected, and formed into the canon. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in this series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.